Buy on MTG. Construct your deck. Command your board. Conquer the table.
Hello, everybody in the wide world of web. This is Rob. I only got 5 cards, so I tried to incorporate a little bit of card draw and card quality, like some ramp stuff. I also am shifting to the Master of Keys as opposed to Amanatu. You're on the play though, so
Hi, I'm Jason. I'm on the play. I am playing my upgraded Duskmourn deck. 10 cards in, unlike Rob's 5. And there we go.
Yeah, sure.
You go.
Oh,
we gotta
we're
go backward.
Yeah, we're going.
Yeah, change it up on me. I'll go last again.
This is Winter with 10 card upgrade. Let's see if we can actually do something this time.
As long as you upgraded.
Oh, I upgrade.
Okay.
Alright, I'm playing the fan favorite, doing some Valgavoth action. I changed the mana base, it was kind of buns, and we're doing some more card draw punishment as well. You're gonna see very soon.
You just claim to be the fan favorite?
Oh, absolutely. Are you kidding me? It's Valgavoth.
Valgavoth!
This is
Alright.
the most wanted deck. I mean,
The
it's
most
only,
wanted.
it's
Alright.
only facts, man.
I'm going to turn off the GoPro and we can get a game going then.
According-
Jason won the die roll, so he is going first. He starts out with a Temple of Mystery, scrying to the bottom, passing to Rob. Rob pretends his top deck is a miracle, revealing a Soul Ring, plays an island, casts a Soul Ring, passing to Seth. Seth plays a command tower and passes to James. James also plays a command tower and then passes to Jason. Jason plays a command tower and taps for 2 to play an overgrown zealot, the Mana Dork. Seth makes a joke about Rob playing a sad robot, and his top deck was in fact that. So Rob plays a land, taps for 4, casts sad robot, goes finds a basic, and passes turn to Seth. Seth plays a land, taps for 2, casts a signet, passes to James. James plays an artifact land, taps for 2 for an arcade signet, passing the turn to Jason. We have all officially ramped. Jason plays a land, taps for 4, and casts what is probably the best card he upgraded and potentially the best card in that entire deck. Threats around every corner. When it comes into play, he manifests. Whenever a face-down permanent comes into play, he searches his library for a basic land, goes into play tapped. With that amazing turn, he passes to Rob. For Rob's turn, he plays a temple, scries up, moves to combat, swings the Solemn Simulacrum at James for 2. Thinks about it, probably should have swung at Jason. Taps for 1 blue, casting Otherworldly Gaze, surveils 3, bins 2 cards, leaves 1 up. Passes to Seth. Seth plays his land for turn, taps for 4, and brings out the commander, Valgavoth. Passing the turn to James, he goes through, plays a land, and follows suit by tapping for 4 and casting his commander, Winter Anthropic Guide. Passing to Jason, he draws for turn, immediately taps for 4, and casts his commander, Duskmourn. The table sighs because they know what is coming. Plays a fetch land for turn, which is going to trigger his commander. He manifests Dread. The manifest coming into play is going to triggering threats around every corner, so he's going to go find a basic. The land entering the battlefield triggers his commander, so he gets to flip it. It's a Soul Ring. Jason's going to pay a life and fetch, which is going to trigger Valgavoth, so he gets a +1 counter and draws a card. Land entering the battlefield is going to trigger his commander again, this time revealing a Hauntwood Shrieker. He moves to combat, swings the Shrieker at Rob for 3 damage, which is going to trigger, he's going to manifest Dread. When the manifest comes into play, it's going to trigger threats around every corner. It's going to go find him a basic. When the basic comes into play, it's going to trigger his commander and let him flip the new manifest. New manifest reveals Secure Tribe Elder. Jason feels like he's accomplished enough this turn, so he passes to Rob. Rob draws for turn, doesn't have an answer, so he swings Sad Robot at Seth, trying to draw another card. Seth obliges. Still digging, Rob pays 1 for a Brainstone, immediately cracks it. Rob plays an Azorius Chancellor for a turn, bouncing a land back, then taps for 3 and plays a Rhystic Study, hoping to find an answer. Passing to Seth, he draws for turn and plays an Ash Barrens, taps for 2, plays a baked potato? Elects to not pay the 1, so Rob gets to draw. Seth taps for 4, plays Shieldred the Apocalypse. You can hear the cringe across the entire table. Rob asks if he wants to pay the 1, so he gets to draw off of Rhystic Study. Moves to combat, swings Valgavoth at Jason for 5 commander damage. That completes his turn, so he passes to James. James draws for turn, triggering Shieldred, so he takes 2 damage, which is going to trigger Valgavoth, so he gets a +1 counter and Seth gets to draw a card. I believe that's a synergy. James plays his land for turn, decides that Shieldred is the biggest threat, taps for 5, plays his Obnixilis, and elects to tick it down to kill Shieldred. Casting the Ob is going to trigger Rhystic, so Rob takes 2 and draws a card. James is done with his turn, so he's passing to Jason. We all brace for Trigger Central Station. Jason untaps and draws for turn, taps for 5, plays Tatiova Benthic Druid. Yo dog, I heard you like triggers. Plays a land for turn, so that's going to trigger Zimone to put a Manifest into play. The land's also going to trigger Tatiova to gain a life and draw a card. The Manifest coming to play is going to trigger threats around every corner. So that's going to go find a land, which is going to trigger Tatiova, put a life and draw a card. That'll trigger the commander again, so he can flip the Manifest. Jason moves to combat, swings the 1/1 at Rob, and the other 2 creatures at Seth. Shrieker has an attack trigger, so he's going to Manifest Dread, which is going to trigger threat around every corner, which is going to trigger Tatiova as well as his commander. Second main, Jason's going to sack Steve to go find a force, which is going to trigger Tatiova, and it's going to trigger his commander. Commander trigger flips a Manifest, but it's a reality shift, so the spell fizzles. Jason pays 6 for a Temur War Shaman. ETB Manifest, which is going to trigger threats, which is going to trigger Tatiova, which is going to trigger his commander. Feeling pretty accomplished, he's passing the turn to Rob. Rob realizes he missed his Rhystic trigger, but he was trying to help Jason with all his triggers. Rob untaps and draws, plays a Thriving Heath, naming black. Rob taps for 5, casts Time Wipe. He wipes the board, everybody does a little housekeeping, and then he passes the turn to Seth. Seth untaps and draws for turn, then taps for 2, and casts Feed the Swarm, targeting threats around every corner. Seth pays the 1 to Rhystic and 4 life to kill the threats around every corner. Then he spends 2 more, paying the 1 to Rhystic for a Blood Artist, passing the turn to James. James untaps and draws for turn, plays a tap land, gaining a life, and then spends the life with Obnixilis to draw a card. James taps for 5, plays a Renin 7, can't pay Rhystic, so Rob draws a card. He ticks him up to 6 to reveal the top 4 cards and puts all land into his hand. Jason untaps and draws for turn, pays 7 for his commander, 1 to Rhystic, and 2 for taxes. He then plays a land for turn, triggering Zimone to Manifest Dread. He then taps for 4 to cast Fertile Footsteps to find a land, pays the 1 for Rhystic. Land entering the battlefield is going to trigger Zimone, so he gets to flip the Manifest to a Head Shredder. Jason then taps for 3 to play a Trail of Mystery, paying the 1 to Rhystic. Passing the turn to Rob, he untap, upkeep, draws for turn, plays a Hall of Heliod's Generosity. Rob taps for 4 to return to dust, targeting Jason's Soul Ring and Hedge Shredder to exile them. Rob then taps for 4, 2 being black for a Nightmare Shepherd. Passing the turn to Seth, he untap, upkeep, draws for turn, missing yet another land drop. Taps for 6 to bring Valgavoth back out, can't pay the Rhystic, so Rob draws. Passing the turn to James, he untaps and draws for turn, plays a Woodland Cemetery as his land for turn. Takes down Renin 7 to make a Tree Folk. Ticks up Obnix, pay a life, draw a card. James paying life on his turn is going to trigger Valgavoth, so Seth puts a +1 counter and draws a card. James taps for 7 for a Hornet Queen, can't pay for Rhystic, so Rob draws a card. Hornet Queen enters the battlefield and makes a bunch of little bug tokens. Passing the turn to Jason, he untaps and draws for turn. Jason plays a Flooded Grove, triggering his commander to Manifest Dread. Manifest entering the battlefield is going to trigger Trail of Mystery, so Jason gets to search for a basic for his hand. Taps for 3 for an Arcane Signet, paying for Rhystic Study. Taps for 8 to cast Beanstalk Giant off of the Adventure, and paying for Rhystic Study. Jason pays 4 for Tyvar the Pummeler, paying 1 to Rhystic. Feeling pretty good with a 15-15 and Tyvar in play, Jason passes the turn to Rob. Rob untaps and draws for turn, plays a Swamp as his land. Rob taps for 5 to cast Master of Keys, milling 2. Doesn't hit anything, so then he taps for 4 to cast out Tyvar, trying to save the table. Passing the turn to Seth, he untaps and draws for turn, and wanted to take the time to point out that he's missed yet another land drop. Get a little moment of silence for Seth. Seth casts a Mask of Pride, can't pay the 1, so Rob draws from Rhystic. Seth finally draws into a land, so he plays the land and then plays a Fate Unraveler. Moves to combat, swings Valgavoth at Jason for another 5 commander damage. Passing the turn to James. James untaps, draws for turn, which is going to trigger Fate Unraveler. Take a damage, which will trigger Valgavoth to get a +1 counter, and Seth will draw a card. James takes up running 7, revealing the top 4 and putting the lands into his hands. James plays a land for turn, takes up Ob to draw a card, paying 1 life to Ob and 1/2 Fate Unraveler. Then taps for 4 to cast 6 and pay for Rhystic Study. James doesn't want to attack, so he moves to clean up, discards 2 cards, and passes to Jason. Jason untaps and draws for turn, which is going to trigger Fate Unraveler, which is going to trigger Valgavoth. Jason pays 10 and channels a Shigeke, so he gets to return 4 non-legendary permanents to his hand. Jason taps for 5, playing Threats Around Every Corner again, and paying for Rhystic Study. Plays his land for turn, going to trigger the Commander, which is going to trigger Threats Around Every Corner, and trigger Trail of Mysteries, and trigger. Flips over a Body of Knowledge, then he immediately cracks Windswept Heath to find another land, which is going to trigger Simone again. This time Simone flips over a Curator Beastie. Jason moves to combat, swings the Body of Knowledge at Seth and the Beanstalk Giant at Rob. Rob elects to block the Beanstalk Giant with the Master of Keys, and Seth blocks with the Blood Artist. 2 Blood Artist triggers. Seth has Jason lose 2 life. Rob has Master of Keys go to the graveyard, but he exiles it with Nightmare Shepherd to make a 1/1 copy, then redirects it to the command zone. That completes Jason's turn, so he passes to Rob. Rob untaps and draws for turn. He's going to take a damage, so Seth's commander gets a +1 counter and he draws a card. Rob plays a land for turn, then taps for 5 to play Spirit Sister's Call. Rob taps for 4 and plays Cramped Vents, dealing 6 damage to Simone, so he'll gain 3 life. Rob moves to his end step, triggering Spirit Sister's Call, so he's going to sacrifice the token copy of Master of Keys to bring back Aminatu, the Veil Piercer. Passing the turn to Seth, he untaps, draws for turn, and plays a land. Seth taps for 5, playing Sir Conrad the Grim. He elects to not pay the 1, so Rob takes 1 damage and draws from Rhystic Study. On Seth's end step, James taps for 3 to destroy Sir Conrad. Rob asks if he wants to pay the 1, and he elects to pay it. Passing the turn to James, he untaps and draws a card. He's going to lose a life, which is going to trigger Valgavoth. James plays a land for turn and then taps for 7 and 1 additional for Rhystic Study, playing a Vile Mutilator. On ETB, James has to sacrifice a creature, so he sacrifices a bug token, forcing each opponent to sacrifice a non-token creature and a non-token enchantment. On Rob's sacrifice, he elects to exile Aminatu to make a 1/1 token copy with Nightmare Shepherd. James then takes up Renin 7, revealing the top 4, putting his lands into his hands. James also ticks down Obnixilus to destroy the Beanstalker Giant. The table says thank you. James moves to combat, swings at Seth. Seth takes the damage, and 6 forces James to mill 3 and return a land from the milled cards to his hand. James moves to clean up, discards a Golgari Rot Farm, and passes to Jason. Jason untaps and draws for turn. Proceeds to pay 9 mana for his commander, 4 for taxes, and 1 to Rhystic Study. Jason then taps for 6, 5 for Eudora, and 1 for Rhystic Study. Jason then plays his land for turn, which is going to trigger Zimone, which is going to trigger Threats Around Every Corner, which is going to trigger Zimone. On Zimone's second trigger, it flips a Trigon Predator. Jason moves to combat, attacks Seth with Curator Beastie, which is going to trigger Manifest, which is going to trigger Threats Around Every Corner, which is going to trigger Zimone. This Zimone trigger flips Thunderfoot Baloff, which has Lieutenant. Seth then taps for 3, casting Bedevil to destroy the attacker, which is going to trigger Rhystic Study, so Rob gets to draw a card. The Curator Beastie dying triggers Eudora, so that's going to bring it back into play as a land, which is going to trigger Zimone, which gets to flip it back over, and he gets his Curator Beastie right back. Face down permanent entering is going to trigger Threat Around Every Corner. Jason then taps for 3, 1 for Rhystic, and Reality Shifts Nightmare Shepherd. Feeling good with his turn, he passes to Rob. Rob untaps and draws for turn, but he has the Aminatu trigger on his upkeep. Rob bins both cards, and for his draw for turn, he reveals Entreat the Angel, so he goes ahead and maxes it out. Making 8 angels, he then plays a land for turn, moves to his end step, sacrifices the Manifest to Spirit Sister's Call to bring back Solemn Simulacrum to get another land. Seth pays 7 for a Massacre Worm, 1 for Rhystic Study. Wiping all the little critters off the board, James loses 8, Rob loses 4. Passing the turn to James, he untaps, draws for turn. Then he ticks up Renin 7 to draw and put the lands into his hand. James plays land for turn, makes the observation that he hasn't missed a land drop all game, and this is now officially turn 9. James discards a land to 6's Retrace ability and pays for Honest Remstein, paying the 1 for Rhystic Study. Honest ETBs, so then James returns Renmaw from the graveyard to his hand. He then taps 6 mana to recast his commander. His commander's cost reduced by 1, but he pays the 1 extra for Rhystic Study. James then ticks up Ob Nixilis to lose a life and draw a card. James moves to end step, Winter triggering, resulting in Hornet coming in from the graveyard, making a bunch of bug tokens, passing to Jason. He then untaps and draws for turn. Jason plays a land for turn. This is going to trigger Zimone, and fortunately for the rest of the table, there's no more basics for Jason to find for threat around every corner. Jason taps for 7 to cast a Walking Ballista, paying for Rhystic Study, which is going to trigger the Curator Beastie, putting 2 more +1 counters on it. Jason removes the 5 counters off a Walking Ballista to shoot Massacre Worm. When it dies from state-based effects, Massacre Worm will see it die, so Jason will lose 2, killing Massacre Worm. When Ballista goes to the graveyard, Eudora is going to see it, so it's going to bring it back face down as a land. Jason moves to combat, swinging a total of 20 power at Seth and a 4/5 flyer at Rob. Seth doesn't want to take 20, so he Infernal Grasps the Lieutenant. When it dies, Eudora is going to see it die, so it's going to bring it back as a face-down land. When a land enters the battlefield, Zimone's going to see it and flip it back over, re-enabling Lieutenant, but that creature is no longer attacking Seth, so now a total of 13 is coming at Seth, and the 4/5 flyer is still at Rob. Rob blocks the 4/5 with 2 Angels, which is going to do the same rigmarole. Eudora, bringing Zimone, flipping it back over. Second main, Jason taps for 4, paying for Rhystic Study to summon a Hauntwood's Shrieker. Jason pays 2 into Hauntwood Shriekers to flip over Walking Ballista, which is going to die to state-based effects. This is going to trigger Eudora as well as Zimone. The Zimone trigger is going to flip Growing Dread this time. This essentially produces a somewhat convoluted loop where he could use Hauntwood Shrieker to flip Walking Ballista. It would die to state-based effects, come back with Eudora, triggering Zimone to allow him to flip it and putting a +1 counter on it with Growing Dread, essentially making each 2 mana 1 damage with Walking Ballista in a giant loop. Rob finally notices that Jason has a Lieutenant in play, so Walking Ballista would have never actually died because it has +2/+2 from the Lieutenant. So we moonwalk back the game a little bit and right the wrongs. A little bit of back and forth, a little bit of in the tank, and Jason elects to just pass the turn to Rob. Rob then taps for 6 for a Fear of Sleep Paralysis, tapping down Jason's Tygon Predator, putting a stun counter on it. Rob then taps for 5 for the Locker Room side of the enchantment, and with the Fear of Sleep Paralysis trigger, he's going to tap down James's Treefolk. Rob moves to combat, swings 6 of the 4/4 Flying Angels at Jason for 24 damage. Jason pumps up his Walking Ballista and shoots Rob in the face for 2 for a little bit of spite love, then gets knocked out of the game. 6 creatures hitting Jason is going to trigger Locker Room 6 times, so Rob gets to draw 6 cards. Rob plays his land for turn, then moves to cleanup, discards down to 7, passes to Seth. Seth untaps and draws for turn, plays a land, taps for 8 to play Valgavoth yet again. He doesn't pay the 1, so Rob gets to draw for Rhystic Study. Rob realizes he missed his Spirit of Sisters call trigger on his end step. Then Seth taps for 2 more and casts a Bloodseeker. Can't pay for Rhystic, so Rob draws again. That completes Seth's turn, so he passes to James. James removes a sleep counter off of his Treefolk, which is in contradiction to Fear of Sleep Paralysis, but it doesn't affect the game. He then untaps and draws for turn. James takes up Renin 7, revealing 4 and putting the lands into his hand. He then takes up Ob Nixilis to lose a life and draw a card. James then taps for 4 to play a Whip of Erebos. He doesn't pay the 1, so Rob draws off for Rhystic. James taps for 7 for Demolisher Spawn. Its cost is reduced by 1, but he pays the 1 to Rhystic. This essentially being a Delirium Craterhoof. Rob taps for 2 and Arcane Denials the Demolisher Spawn. James moves to end step, so Rob's going to cycle Ash Baron, and Winter is going to trigger for James, resulting in Giant Ataphage entering the battlefield, which is going to trigger Seth's Bloodseeker, so James is going to lose a life. James losing a life is going to trigger Seth's Valgavoth. Passing the turn to Rob, he untaps and draws for turn. Rob plays a land for turn, and then taps for 3 for a Mirror Maid, coppering Fear of Sleep Paralysis. This is going to trigger the Bloodseeker, so he's going to lose a life, and it's going to put 2 stun counter triggers on the stack. The loss of life is going to trigger Valgavoth, so Seth gets to put a +1 counter and draw a card. With the stun counters, Rob tapped down 2 of James's creatures. Rob then spends 1 to unlock Bottomless Pool, which is going to trigger Mirror Maid and the Sleep Paralysis to tap down 2 more creatures, and it's going to bounce 1 back to its owner's hand. Electing to tap down Valgavoth and 1 of the insects, and returns 1 of the insect tokens to James's hand. Rob then taps for 3 for an Ancient Cellar Spawn, triggering the Fear of Sleep Paralysis and the Mirror Maid, tapping down the last 2 bugs that James has. It's going to trigger Bloodseeker, so Rob loses a life. Rob then taps for 5 for a Demon of Fates design, which is going to trigger the Ancient Cellar Spawn to apply a damage, but it's also going to trigger the Fear of Sleep Paralysis as well as the Mirror Maid to tap down 2 additional permanents. Rob taps down 2 more of James's creatures, so there are no longer any flyers or reach across the board on either opponent. Rob moves to combat, sends 5 4/4 flyers at James for lethal in the air, and 2 4/4 flyers in Fear of Sleep Paralysis at Seth for a total of 14. This knocks out James and leaves Seth at 2. It's also going to trigger Locker Room 8 times, so Rob gets to draw 8 cards. Rob plays his land for turn, a Bajuka Bog, emptying Seth's graveyard, and then discards to hand size and passes to Seth. Seth wants to go out on his own terms, so he taps for 3 and casts Blood Pact to draw 2 and lose 2. Rob says no thank you, so in response he taps for 1 and swords Valgavoth to gain Seth 6 life. Seth figures screw it, so he pays 1 for Basilisk Collar, letting Rob draw off Aristic. He then taps for 3 for Theater of Horror, Rob draws off Aristic. Taps for 3 for Mayhem Devils, Rob draws off Aristic. Passing the turn to Rob, Rob untaps, draws for turn, and moves straight to combat and swings for lethal. Rob wins the game. Hello, everybody. Overall, it was a really fun game. Total end time ended up being, I think, 1 hour and 55 minutes, so just shy of 2 hours. That is with a little bit of BS, and in the middle, we talk a little bit, but overall, we have a good time, and that's what it's all about. Jason's deck was really popping off, and honestly, if it didn't take the cooperative efforts of the entirety of the table, he hands down would have had that game. I think just overall, they're really fun precons. In my personal opinion, the Simic deck, just doing Simic landfall things, is probably the strongest one. I mean, you know how it is, though. Sometimes I got a cat in my lap. Little Eevee. Anyways, it was just a blast. Had a good time with everybody. So next week, everybody else is going to get 10 additional cards, and I'm only going to get 5 more. I do believe leaning into the card draw synergies and a little bit of tax stuff is probably the right answer. I'm probably just going to pop back to Aminatou. I know Master of Keys it feels like the stronger of the 2 commanders, but it requires a huge overhaul in that deck to make it more synergistic from get-go. But either way, I'm going to upload today, hopefully, and well, it'll always be today whenever you watch the video, so me saying today is obviously today. But I'm going to upload later and try and incorporate all of the upgraded deck lists from those that actually sent me theirs. And I appreciate everybody that's been watching, and maybe week 4 we might do full tilt upgraded versions of the deck. If that's something that you would like to see, go ahead and pop it down in the comments down below, and I don't know, I'll have fun making these goofy videos and gameplay, and as long as you're enjoying them, I'll keep making them. I'm Rob, this is Bion MTG. Good luck and have fun.
Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment down below.